Tonight, Scott Morrison on his future. Could he be what I've suggested, a foreign minister in a Dutton government? And should Anthony Albanese have visited Israel, a rare political swipe from Morrison after a year and a half of holding his tongue? Also tonight, the Optus boss makes a goose of herself again, and how one candidate in the US Republican debate today totally blew it with a personal attack on another one's daughter.
You're just easy.
And a shocking meeting of more than 250 ABC journalists angry that the ABC is apparently still not biased enough. Well, not against Israel anyway. While more than 100 Australians who survived the Holocaust warn never since the Nazis have they seen this much anti-Semitism. But first, I warned last night, don't let Anthony Albanese go travelling with our credit card. But too late, he's just fallen for another global warming sting. He flew on another junket, this time to the Pacific Island Forum, with our credit card, and today slapped on another $350 million to give to Pacific countries for, well, you guessed it, global warming.
We're providing some $350 million in our Pacific Climate Infrastructure Financing Partnership. That was part of the commitment that we took to the election. In addition to that, we have at least $2 billion of climate financing commitment across the globe as part of our existing ODA commitments that we've made. And we will have further discussions and more announcements tomorrow, including specific programs that we've been asked to support by Tuvalu.
I mean, can you believe that? 350 million over there, 2 billion over here, and more money soon for Tuvalu. I mean, Tuvalu does not need our money for global warming. I mean, as I've said so often, global warming is no threat there. The science is clear. Studies in the past 5 years show Tuvalu is growing, not sinking under rising seas. And the weight of evidence tells us there are actually fewer cyclones as well, including fewer severe ones. I mean, seriously. I mean, global warming over there is a cargo cult, and Albanese just fell for it again with your money. In fact, I had to laugh when the Prime Minister said this after this big announcement of the millions he'd now hand over to these very lucky Pacific leaders.
It's been extremely positive, the reception that Australia has received here. There's a recognition that my government is committed to climate action.
No kidding. Extremely positively received. Well, that tends to happen when you dump a whole bunch of money in the laps of Pacific leaders. They would like it. Money that comes from Australian taxpayers, some of whom are struggling to put food on their own table back here at home. But all this when there's actually a bit of a bombshell admission that now exposes this farce. Albanese should actually have a word with his own government solicitor's office, because they there are trying to fight this ludicrous climate scare to save you money while the Prime Minister is off overseas spending it. Now, yesterday, the federal court resumed hearing a case in which a couple of Torres Strait Islanders are suing the government for not doing enough to stop global warming, which they claim is threatening their island.
We don't want to be a climate change refugees.
Now, the charity that's supporting this case is in total apocalyptic mode, totally over the top, Greta Thunberg-ish, like that guy I had on last night who's starving himself to death in front of Parliament to force the government to scrap coal exports. Well, this group supporting this claim says, if we don't achieve those emissions reductions in time, we're talking about what people are describing as a cultural genocide waiting to happen on the Torres Strait. Now, I would bet that woman $1,000 there will be no cultural genocide on those islands because of our emissions. Make it 10,000. The federal court has been, well, of course, gone to have a look at the alleged damage caused over there by our emissions, the rising seas and all that. But here's the thing. The Australian government solicitor has blown the whistle on all this. This idea that little Australia actually has the power to change the climate and so stop islands from supposedly drowning. Now, it says Australia's just too small. The government's own solicitors says because the respondent, that's Australia, because Australia contributes a very small proportion of global greenhouse gas emissions, close to about 1%, it is not reasonably foreseeable that its conduct would cause the applicants and group members, the islanders in this case, any harm. In fact, the government solicitor says Australia lacks the necessary control to prevent or materially mitigate climate change or its impacts. It's exactly like I have said for years, and what the former chief scientist finally admitted, Australia's emissions have virtually no effect at all on the climate. Yet there is Albanese scattering your money to the winds, and not just in the Pacific with his 350 million here and 2 billion there, at home, spending billions more on hideous wind farms and 10,000 kilometres of transmission wires to hook them all up, and on that snowy 2.0 scheme that's 10 times over budget. All that, and the government's own solicitor says in a court document, you can't lie, well actually, Australia's too small. Australia can't control or limit in any material way what global warming we've had. Game over. Can someone please shove that advice under Anthony Albanese's nose before he wastes even more of your money on fake fixes to a fake catastrophe? But this war on fossil fuels, coal and gas, we've got a reminder today just what will happen if the Greens and that hunger strike I had on last night really do get their way and stop all coal and gas. The tax office today released figures showing the corporates last financial year paid a whopping $84 billion in tax. That's up from the year before by $15 billion. And the mining companies actually pay a big slice of that.
In fact, the 2023 numbers, when they get published next year, will show that the oil and gas companies have paid in excess of $11 billion of tax for the 23 year.
11 billion, and that doesn't include royalties, many billions more, doesn't include share dividends, a lot to super funds, doesn't include wages. Now, the idea that we should get rid of all that to save the planet, when even the government solicitor says Australia's emissions don't even make a difference, it's insane. Joining me is Nationals frontbencher Barnaby Joyce, the former Deputy Prime Minister. Barnaby Joyce, great to see you again. Look, the Prime Minister announcing hundreds of millions more dollars for global warming schemes in the Pacific, plus $2 billion is already committed, plus help for Tuvalu, which isn't even drowning. Seriously, someone's got to stop this guy.
Get along with Pacific Islanders is very important, especially considering what the Chinese are doing. So I think we should see this in multiple levels, Andrew. But you're dead right. You just mentioned, how do these people think we're ever going to have a surplus if you get rid of your main income earners, which is like coal and gas? How do you think you're ever going to pay for your hospitals? You've got people who want increases in pensions, that they want to have better social security, they want new roads, they want all manner. They want us to subsidise renewables, which I don't want to do. The money's got to come from somewhere. It's accountancy 101. Somebody out there has to have the cash, has to have the loot. And if you say to that person, I don't want your money anymore, then you've got to be honest about it, say, and I don't want that hospital, and I don't want that school, and I don't want that road, and I don't want that pension increase, because I'm pure about this. We'll have to have one other thing there, with all the things talking about, like you talk about wages, PAYG, the corporate tax rates, the royalties. What about GST? GST on all the things they buy and sell.
Look, I don't get it either. Barnaby is blowing a gale where you are. We had rain last week and you got nice wind today. I'm going to persist. Listen, the thing here is, what do you make? And I've got to thank the team at Ben Fordham's show at 2GB for tipping me off on this too. What do you make of the government solicitor telling the federal court, well, actually, Australia is too small. It contributes a very small proportion of global greenhouse gas emissions, so you can't foresee that it's going to cause people here harm. Australia lacks the necessary control to materially mitigate or even prevent climate change. Barnaby, all those billions for nothing, because the government's own solicitors are saying we can't make a difference to the climate. I mean, that's game over, isn't it?
Well, we can't. That's the whole point. We can't. This is a virtue of us that will participate to a program
where we actually, as far as Australia's concerned, don't change a single thing, not an iota. But we do put our power prices through the roof, our reliability through the floor, get a whole heap of overseas companies. Some of them are just real estate companies. They're not interested in the environment. They're interested in making a bucket load of money. They're Chinese real estate companies coming to Australia, putting wind towers all over there, transmission lines all back through there, listeners. And then do you think that a Chinese or Hong Kong real estate company wants to save the environment in Australia? No, they're looking for a fool, and they found one. You. And you're going to pay for it. And is it going to change the climate? Not a bit. And I'm sorry about the wind, but we've got storms here. I've been out mustering cattle for the wedding and picking up cow pats and moving them away and moving rocks away. And I'm dressed for how we make sure that this wedding works. We don't want anyone stepping in cow manure.
Mate, cow manure is very good for the soil, so don't pick up too much of it. Just lastly, the wind is beating us, but I do want to ask you about this. Saturday, Remembrance Day, you're Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. Where are your thoughts on this?
Okay, it's your family line, right? It's your great-grandfathers, your great-granduncles, your great-great-grandfathers. It's all the people who served. They ask one thing of you. For 1 minute at the 11th of the 11th, so at 11 o'clock on Saturday, for 1 minute, that's it, 1 minute, just shut up. You don't need to be on your phone. You don't need to be at your computer. You don't need to be talking to anybody. For 1 minute, just shut up. See if you can do that. Because these people went through hell. And you've got to remember, when people say, I was over there, the first casualties, the first fatalities of the First World War, were in Papua New Guinea. Remember, that was a German colony. So very close to home. Don't forget that. If we'd lost the First World War, we're in a whole heap of strife. So your forebears went to fight it. I'll be going to a service at 11 a.m. in Tamworth on Armistice Day. But if you can't make it, just do one thing. See if you can be good enough to do this. I'm just trying to soften it. Just shut up. See if you can be disciplined enough just to shut up for a minute.
Well said, Barnaby. Listen, if you want some help in getting people to shut up for not just an hour, but a minute, but a whole hour or maybe a half a day, why don't you get in contact with Optus? They probably could arrange that again. Barnaby Joyce, thank you so much indeed for your time. More than 200 ABC journalists yesterday proved something very disturbing about the national broadcaster. However biased against Israel it is, still not enough. Yesterday, those journalists held a mass meeting about the ABC's coverage of the war in Gaza, a war that was started, of course, by the Hamas terrorist group that actually runs Gaza. Now, we're told this meeting was emotional. We're told it was at times heated. And I would have hoped these journalists were emotional and heated about the clear ABC bias we're already seeing against Israel from many ABC journalists. It's just one of many examples I've been showing.
Don't these comments contradict your statement and instead demonstrate the Israeli government's blatant disregard for Palestinian civilians? What number of Palestinian people killed is a satisfactory number for the Israeli government?
In fact, it's the exact opposite. And we've got the Sydney Morning Herald report that's co-written by the son of the very anti-Israel Green Senator Marine Faruqi, saying, well, the ABC staff instead claimed that the ABC too often relied on the talking points of Israel's defence forces. And they were concerned, these staff, about the ABC's apparent unwillingness to use language such as invasion and occupation and genocide and apartheid and ethnic cleansing regarding Israeli government policy. Not a word about what Hamas is planning for Israel. Joining me is Michael Danby, former Labor MP and former editor of the Australia-Israel Review. Michael Danby, thanks for your time. More than 200 ABC staff apparently suggesting, according to the Sydney Morning Herald report, that the ABC is too pro-Israel. complaining, for instance, that they can't accuse it of genocide, they can't accuse it of apartheid. Your response?
Unfortunately, it shows you the long march through the institutions that's taken place there at Ultimo. Andrew, I've been surprised, as I note you have, that however ABC 7:30 host Sarah Ferguson seems to have been tough on both sides. She's asked Mark Regev some hard questions, and she also gave that Hamas spokesman the rounds of the kitchen. So as long as it doesn't affect the coverage of major people like that, we're okay. But it just shows you what's happening elsewhere in ABC 24 and in Radio National and all of the corners where these people hide on our taxpayers' money.
Yeah, but it also shows you the rising generation of the ABC. You think it's bad now, wait 5 years. This bit of the report was interesting, Michael, that a number of journalists from Muslim and Arab backgrounds have expressed concern that a perception the ABC was too pro-Israel had impacted their relationships with their communities and their ability to do their jobs even. Now, that's ominous for me. I mean, I'm thinking the ABC's coverage, it should be altered so that staff who are Arab and Muslim, and the ABC has gone to great pains to recruit them, have an easier time in their communities, by which they don't mean the wider Australian community, of course. I mean, seriously, Michael, what is going on?
Shouldn't all journalists be held to the same standard regardless of background? I hope, to your earlier point, that some of these young people eventually grow up and see there is a wider world. We never demanded that there be an equal number of casualties when we were bombing the Germans or the Japanese in the righteous and just war, Second World War, or similarly with Daesh, with ISIS. So the sickening body count that these people impose and then say they can't reconcile it with their communities is not the way objective journalists should look at it, or anyone with any historical insight.
What's happening at the ABC, Michael, is really appalling, and the coalition, should they win government in the next election, have really got to do something about it. Today, more than 100 Holocaust survivors living in Australia have issued a joint statement with their pictures on it, or at least of those who dared to be identified in these days, saying, never did we think that we would witness a reenactment of this senseless and virulent hatred of Jews that we faced in Europe, under the Nazis, they mean. They go on, the actions of Hamas are so familiar, so barbaric, yet instead of condemning this, the response across the globe is a shameful spike in anti-Semitism. Is that how you see it?
Shamefully, it started here in Australia, outside the Opera House, with those infamous scenes, gas the Jews, kill the Jews, Andrew, which shames all Australians and is being repeated around the world again and again and again in the months since, as the paradigm of this lunatic prejudice that's sprung from these terrible murders and slaughter that took place on the 7th of October. There was a ceasefire before the 7th of October, and this is a cri de coeur, a cry from the heart, that these wonderful elderly people, many of whom I know, they feel that they have to intervene in politics, just shows you how serious the situation is. When the cruelty of Daesh was manifest throughout the Middle East, when they established their so-called Islamist state, there were vigils all around the world in support of the victims. And, they're feeling the silence of many people who are probably too afraid to speak up against these violent mobs in the city. And part of the problem is, on our behalf, the organs of the state, the ASIO and the police need to stand up more. How can we have people beaten up who are selling poppies in British railway stations, or elderly men in the street being beaten to death as they were in Los Angeles, or someone in Arncliffe, as Sharry Markson pointed out last night? This is not good enough. This is what these 100 courageous survivors are giving us moral leadership on.
Yeah, well, where's your Labor Party, Michael? Where's the Labor Prime Minister? I mean, seriously, they're on mute on this one.
Albo should get back to Australia. Penny Wong should speak out about this. I know Richard Miles and Peter Khalil have got these Trotskyist and Islamist fanatics demonstrating outside their office to try and stifle them. But these people should speak up. Bob Hawke would have, Kim Beazley would have, Bill Shorten would have, and they need to say that this anti-Jewish rhetoric and violence can't continue. I hope Chris Minns pursues those evil people who yelled that outside the Opera House and who have defamed Australia all around the world. It's much more so than the referendum. It's influencing how people perceive Australia. We need to act not because only to protect the sensibilities of the Jewish minority in Australia, but these people smell our fear, the Islamists. If we don't act, something worse will happen here in Australia. So I implore the police and ASIO to act within the law, but use the law against these people.
Michael Danby, I used to be very much against censorship of political views, but it's starting to become very ominous, very threatening, and I suspect you could be right. It could lead to something really quite shocking. Thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Andrew, for having me.
After the break, Scott Morrison has been treated like dirt by even his own party, but should the Liberals bring him back from the cold? We'll talk about his future, and he has a message for Anthony Albanese. I said 2 nights ago and in my columns yesterday, the opposition can now win the next election, but of course they need to reshuffle to look more like a really good, strong alternative government that can hit the road running. They've got politicians, though, sitting on the backbench at the moment, you see, with more drive and experience than some on the front bench. I mean, Matt Canavan, obviously, Keith Pitt, for instance, and Scott Morrison. Now, the response I've had to that idea has been, shall I say, mixed. I mean, many on the left clearly hate his guts for winning a miracle election some years ago, but even some Liberals hate him for then losing the last election, and particularly for not fighting the culture wars that then helped to actually destroy Morrison. But its critics forget that Morrison was a good immigration minister, for instance, and I spoke to him a short while ago from his office in the Shire. Scott Morrison, thanks for joining me. It has been tough for you, hasn't it? You've been scapegoated by your own party, really. A number of your colleagues I see treating you a bit like a leper. That's got to be hard for even the toughest of people. How have you coped with that?
When you go into politics, and it's got a lot worse over the last 15 or so years of when I first went in, but you don't complain about these things. Of course, the arrows and darts come your way, and that's the nature of being in politics, and particularly in modern politics. So, look, it's just something you deal with. I've got a wonderful family. I've got a strong faith. I've got tremendous supporters, and there isn't literally a day that passes when I'm out and about where people don't pop up to me in the street and say thank you very much and for the service that I was able to provide. And I'm very grateful that I had that opportunity. It wasn't just the almost 4 years I served as Prime Minister, but almost 9 years in Cabinet itself across a range of different portfolios. And over the entire time, over the last 16 years, being able to serve a community I loved deeply here in the Shire in southern Sydney.
I've been impressed by how you've been carving out a new role for yourself lately. Now, you were this week in Israel, explaining very powerfully why its war against Hamas was really ours too. It's a civilizational war, in my view. You were warning against the anti-Semitism here, which is shocking. Before that, you were in Taiwan, again talking up the cause of freedom, suggesting closer ties with Australia. You've also correctly linked the defence of Ukraine to our defence against the new threat from this axis of authoritarians, China, Russia and Iran coming together to really challenge the world order. Why have you thrown yourself into all this?
Well, I first spoke about what I call the arc of autocracy back when I was Prime Minister. I mean, it wasn't as fashionable a phrase back then, but I could see it then, and that was back in March of 22, I think, a speech I gave to the Lowy Institute. But that had been the impression that had been forming for some time. there are those who want to see the world order different to what it is today, and you set them out who the key candidates are, and it's of course the People's Republic of China and the government there. It's the Islamic Republic of Iran and the tyrannical regime in Russia, and then you can add North Korea on that to boot. They would like to see the world run very differently, based on power only, and to basically set up regional hegemonic franchises where they can pretty much do and go as they please. And, you know, as a government, we were very keen to say no to that, particularly in our own region, and be joined with wonderful partners in the United States and in Japan and in India in particular as part of the Quad. But then the AUKUS partnership I was able to put together with the United States and Great Britain. So, you know, since losing the election and you know, continuing to serve in the Parliament, I mean, you have the opportunity, they come your way as an ex-Prime Minister, to go and make various presentations at important forums around the world, and I've maintained that keen interest in those issues. Also maintain a pretty keen interest in the work we're doing in critical minerals and rare earths strategy, which, you know, we initiated in government, and that's frankly also part of the same agenda when it comes to critical supply chains and what that means for global security. So, you know, just because you don't win the last election, it doesn't mean that your interest in these issues fade. When you're Prime Minister, you're working across many, many fronts. And after that time concludes, well, you have an opportunity to focus particularly on those that you are most passionate about.
It's weird, isn't it? I sometimes get the sense that Australia's a little bit, we're isolated and insulated as a result from what's really going on. So I was seeing footage earlier this week of people in Japan doing practicing air raid alerts, you know, huddling in shelters. At Taiwan, they do this too, people having to rush to shelters in preparation for a war that they think is could be imminent. Here, we don't seem to sense quite how in the balance all this is at the moment.
Well, I think that's true, but would you really want it differently for our kids and for the peace of our communities and our suburbs and towns? But I think there is that greater reality that dawns on you when you're in those places, and I've been in most of them. I mean, just when I was with Boris in Israel just a few days ago, we're on a 15-second warning for rockets coming out of Gaza, where we were at the kibbutz that was so devastatingly attacked, and the atrocities that were committed there. And that goes with life even during normal times in places like that. Up in Taiwan, it was very similar. I was there on their National Day, and I just couldn't help but thinking as I sat there and I looked at the parade that was going past, and I looked around the city, and it is the proximity of the mainland China, which threatens Taiwan on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis. You can't escape it. So, you know, I give thanks that we live in a country where those sorts of threats aren't as ever present. But, you know, it also means that sometimes we fail to appreciate, you know, the reality of some of those circumstances overseas, and particularly in Israel. I mean, what occurred on the 7th of October was an evil that eclipsed even ISIS. The premeditation of the planning of the atrocities that were committed on over 1,400 innocent Israelis, including babies. I mean, there was a 9-month-old baby that was taken hostage after their parents were cold-blooded murdered in their home. There were women who were scalped, women who were raped. The people's hands were tied as they were murdered, and their bodies desecrated. I mean, this was the most heinous of crimes. And what was most chilling, as I was listening to the accounts and being shown where these things took place, was the premeditation, the organisation, the planning, the drilling that would have occurred in order to go and commit these atrocities, which came in waves and waves and waves. I mean, the terror that must have been felt by those innocents, just, I can't describe it. And it was a very overwhelming thing to be able to be there. I'm pleased I went, though, because I think it's important that we understand what's happening in the Middle East right now happened because of Hamas's evil acts, and they cannot go unaddressed because they will happen again if they go unaddressed. That's the key point. There can be no moral equivalency drawn between Israel's self-defence and Hamas's acts of atrocity.
And of course, a bloodlust like that, a worldview like that, does not stop with the destruction of Israel. If they could achieve that, this is a problem for all Western civilization, in my view. But you know, despite
if they behead their babies, they'll behead others' babies too.
Yeah, absolutely, but they draw a line. You know, only these people come off it. But you know what disturbs me?
Right,
like, some of the horrors you're talking about. Anyone can see if they chose to. It's on the internet now, and yet you see in Australia this anti-Semitism, this lack of sympathy for what happened, and this rabid anti-Semitism like I've never seen before in this country. And I haven't heard the Prime Minister take a really firm stand against it, by the way. What would you have done? What should he do?
Well, I'll speak for what I have done, and it would have been no different had I been Prime Minister. I have a long-standing relationship with the Jewish community in this country, and I've enjoyed that relationship greatly, and I grieve with them. I just grieve with them and feel as best as I can what they must be going through. I mean, to in your own country, to have people chanting these anti-Semitic slogans. I mean, on the front page of the Australian today, Holocaust survivors for the first time feeling the need to speak out in the way they have. And when I was reading that article earlier today, that experiencing this makes them relive the terrible atrocities they lived through, and that this is occurring in Australia, but not just here. I saw it when I was in the UK as well, and arguably even worse. But this is something that should never take place in Australia. You know, when people talk about the fact that they've been to Holocaust museums and that they light candles and crystal nuts today, and they say never again, but you can't say that if you're not standing today and seeking to support Israel in how they deal with this terrible, the worst single day of atrocity committed against the people of Israel since the Holocaust. I mean, when you let that fact sink in, then it is just unimaginable that people in Australia would be saying what they're saying. It is just, it is a shame. It is a great shame.
If you were Prime Minister, would you have gone to Israel?
If I had, well, probably, I think I would. I'm not going to sit here and second guess what the Prime Minister should be doing now. It's up to him to make those judgments. And I've sought since the election not to engage in that sort of commentary wherever I could avoid it, unless I've been directly attacked, which has happened on more than one occasion. But I know what I would do, and I think that Jewish Australians need to know that their cause is a right one, given the atrocities committed against them.
No, I totally agree with you there. Now, I've suggested on this show and in my newspaper columns yesterday that with your experience you would make a good foreign affairs spokesman for the opposition, like Bill Hayden was for Bob Hawke after he lost his leadership of the Labor Party. Have you totally ruled out staying in politics beyond the next election?
I have expressed nothing beyond what I'm doing in this term of Parliament, Andrew, and that remains the case. We're about mid-term, and obviously, decisions are going to have to be made at some point in time. But I haven't expressed any statement beyond this term of Parliament, and I'm there. I was elected at the last election, and I've been serving my electorate since then. But if I could just, if you don't mind, Andrew,
but if the opportunity came up to serve
about Israel, sorry. Well, I know I haven't offered myself
if the opportunity came up
to return to the front bench, and I'm not offering myself up to that role. The party has got some great people there serving in the Parliament, and I look forward to them all getting the opportunities that I have had. And I'm not offering myself a role on the front bench, no. But I appreciate
that wasn't the question, really, but you're too much of the politician, I guess. The Liberals under Peter Dutton have actually done what, well, as you know, I said at the time you should have done more of, culture wars. He did fight The Voice, for instance. Next, I think, is going to be taking on global warming extremism, or at least certainly hope that. That's a good place to end, actually. Thank you so much indeed for your time, Scott Morrison. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Andrew. Good to talk to you.
He's not offering himself, but he didn't say no. Scott Morrison will in fact be just one of the people featuring in the Liberals in Power documentary, a terrific two-part series. It's going to screen on Sky News at 8 p.m. starting next Monday. Don't miss it. After the break, a Republican challenger to be president just blew up his campaign in the middle of the third debate of the challengers. So who is left to fight Donald Trump to be the Republican guy at the next election? Well, Donald Trump did it again. He turned the latest Republican debate, the third one, like he had turned the other two, into a bit of an empty theatre today, simply by not turning up. In fact, holding a rival rally. So there were the 5 other surviving candidates on the stage in Florida trying to prove to the Republicans why they should be the party's choice to run against President Joe Biden in a year from now, while Trump skipped it all to hold his own rally also in Florida and attack Biden in his typical Trump style that's making him the favourite at the next election.
Just like the Cuban regime, the Biden regime is trying to put their political opponents in jail, shutting down free speech, taking bribes and kickbacks to enrich themselves and their very spoiled children.
And after today's debate between the rest of the field, Trump has probably got one less challenger to worry about. Entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy, he was looking for a while like the hot new thing, pitching to the Republicans hard right and to conspiracy theorists, getting all these talking points from TikTok and all that. But today blew it by attacking the daughter of rival Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina, who has been shooting up in the polls.
I want to laugh at why Nikki Haley didn't answer your question, which is about looking at families in the eye. In the last debate, she made fun of me for actually joining TikTok while her own daughter was actually using the app for a long time. So you might want to take care of your family first.
Leave my daughter out of your voice.
Your adult daughter. The next generation of Americans are using it. And that's actually the point. You have her supporters propping her up. That's fine. Here's the truth.
You're just
the easy answer.
Scum. Well, that's getting it said. Joining me from Minnesota is John Hinderaker, president of the Center for the American Experiment and a writer on the most excellent Powerline blog. John Hinderaker, it's great to catch up with you. Your take on the debate?
Well, Andrew, it was a lively evening. I think it's good for the Republican Party that we've got it down now to 5 candidates. It's a lot more manageable. We've got more serious candidates. I thought all 5 did pretty well in appealing to their different constituencies. I still think that the serious candidates are Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley. But I think that very likely any of those 5, with the possible exception of Vivek Ramaswamy, would beat Joe Biden. I think it's a pretty good group.
Well, that's a big rap for Chris Christie, but there are actually 6 candidates, and the 6th one who wasn't there was Donald Trump. You saw him on the stage, obviously trying to gazump the debate itself. Do you think any of those 5 that were on the stage would actually take the Republican nomination from Trump?
Well, Andrew, I don't think we know what's going to happen. The polls obviously show Trump way out in the lead. I'm very skeptical about that. The reality is nobody has cast a vote. They're all tied at 0. Nobody's got a delegate. Nobody's got a vote. The Iowa caucuses are in January. Kim Reynolds, the very popular Republican governor of Iowa, has endorsed Ron DeSantis just yesterday. I think people need to start voting. And I think when people start voting in Iowa and New Hampshire, the picture could look very different.
Well, that's interesting. Now, you've mentioned Ron DeSantis. He was there, the Florida governor. He was a long time the front runner of the other candidates. Trump's always been ahead. But his numbers have sunk. And Nikki Haley's, the former governor, hers have risen. And again, she seems more polished with every outing. Do you think that she is Donald Trump's real threat here?
Well, we'll find out, Andrew. I think she's a threat. I think she has performed well in these debates, and I think that has helped her. I think the other thing that's helping her, I hear this from a lot of Republicans, is a lot of people think that she's the most electable of the candidates, the one most likely to win. And Republicans are desperate for victory. And I think that's one of the things that has been buoying her campaign.
Absolutely, but it's also, she seems quite sharp as well, and being a female might help with the women's vote. But look, maybe I'm translating some of the Australian factors to an American context, and that might not work. But Joe Biden, meanwhile, I mean, John, would it be right to say Joe Biden is the big question mark in this whole election? If there's one person that's the most influential in a sense, he says he still will fight the next election. He's not going to stand aside for another candidate, even though polls say voters think he's too old, and he'll probably lose, and lose especially if the Republican candidate is Nikki Haley. If he did step aside, that would completely change, probably, the character of the whole contest. What do you think is going to happen? Will he run? Won't he run? If he does run, do the Democrats have a better chance?
Andrew, I've been saying for quite a long time that Joe Biden will not be the Democratic nominee, and I still believe that that is true. They have a terrible, terrible problem, how to get rid of Joe Biden and also how to get rid of Kamala Harris, who is just as unpopular as Biden, if not more so. And, you know, the polling that is being done recently, Andrew, you see a lot of the comparison Trump versus Biden. But what hasn't been so much publicized is polling Biden versus a generic Republican, or Biden versus DeSantis, or Biden versus Haley. Biden is crushed in swing states by the generic Republican, and he's losing badly to Haley and to DeSantis. I think that one way or another, the Democrats are going to find a way to get Joe Biden out of that race and substitute somebody else. And then the big question is who? You know, people talk about Gavin Newsom. He's got a terrible record as governor of California. I don't know. We'll see.
John Hunter-Recker, always great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.
After the break, even Homer Simpson goes woke, but maybe this is in a good way. And the latest bizarre defence by the head of Optus after its disaster yesterday. Now, the Muslim extremists in Sydney that I exposed on Monday, shouting, "Kill the Jews" and calling for jihad, that's one particular threat. But another is the increasing links I see being made by Aboriginal radicals between the Hamas-led war against Israel and the supposed Aboriginal movement here in Australia. I mean, yet another example just tweeted today by Amy McQuire, who's an activist at the Queensland University of Technology. Blackfella Palestinian solidarity. Now, if that kind of linkage takes off, what do you think some younger activists might do here, inspired by what Hamas is doing in Israel? I mean, seriously. Joining me is Sky News presenter James McPherson of The Late Debate here on Sky at 10 p.m. and Evelyn Ray, writer and regular on the new Sky News show, The Sunday Showdown, Sundays at 7 p.m. James, I'm now seeing this link made quite often. Strikes me as rather frightening.
Well, if anything, Aboriginals have got more in common with Jews. Aboriginals are Indigenous to Australia and the Jews are Indigenous to Israel. They've been there 4,000 years. But if you must have some comparisons or likenesses between Aboriginals and Palestinians, well, here's a couple. Neither of them have had their land stolen, and neither of them have been subject to genocide, unlike the Jewish people, who continually have their land attempted to be stolen by Arab nations and who have been subject to multiple attempted genocides throughout history. The motivation for this, Andrew, is Palestinian supporters want to somehow localise their protests so it's got some local appeal, and for Indigenous activists, linking with the Palestinian cause gives them the opportunity to be part of something global. So it's a marriage of convenience between two groups that really have nothing in common.
Yeah, It's so playing with fire. Evelyn, I want to skip quickly to the Optus thing because I can't believe this. I'm stunned that Optus, they knew enough about what happened that they can fix this outage eventually, but they still won't describe it. Its boss, Kelly Bayer Rosmarin, gave the most bizarre answer to the Financial Review. She said, it's a very technical explanation for what happened. There is no soundbite that's going to do it justice. So we want to really bottom out the root cause, whatever that means. And when we have that very clear and in a digestible form, we will be forthcoming. No explanation for now. I mean, what's going on?
I think regardless of whatever happened and the cause behind it, there's a really important lesson for us Australians to learn from yesterday. And that is the overwhelming push from our government and elites to move from the physical world to the digital world. I mean, they want digital ID, they want cashless societies, they want digital passports. And what yesterday did was demonstrate how vulnerable Australia would be if we centralise our information that way on the internet. I mean, completely dependent on technology when we can't even understand it. It's unpredictable. It's catastrophic. I mean, what's going to happen when it fails? I mean, we lost toilet paper during COVID and there were stabbings down in Western Sydney. So I can't imagine if we went 12 hours full, without any of this digital information and how we would survive. So I think there's a good lesson to be learnt from it, regardless of whatever the cause was.
I'm with you on that. But James, not telling people, saying, well, look, I can't digest it in a simple soundbite. Well, there are clever people out there that might like the information, might understand it. I don't know. Is this because if we actually knew what happened, we'd probably be suing someone?
And that's the problem with the position they've taken. It's very technical. Well, when I hear that, I think, OK, either they have no idea what happened or they know exactly what happened and they're too afraid to tell us. And that is not a way to build confidence in your customer base.
No, and it's also treating people so arrogantly. I can't believe it. I've got some amazing news that The Simpsons, I mean, I wouldn't have thought that wokeness would come to The Simpsons and care for each other, but it used to feature Homer strangling his son, Bart. But the cartoon has now announced a whole new policy. Here it is.
Whoa, that's quite a grip.
See, Marge? Strangling the boy has paid off. Just kidding. I don't do that anymore. Times have changed.
Evelyn, is that Homer gone woke, or is it actually highly appropriate? How did we put up with the strangling scenes in the first place?
Look, I think it's a cartoon. I've never heard of a grown adult man strangling his child and saying, oh, I didn't know it was inappropriate because I used to watch it on The Simpsons. I don't think we can baby-proof every sharp corner of the world because some adults can't learn to walk straight. And I think, as Candace Owens so aptly said, life's tough, wear a helmet.
James, what do you make of it?
Andrew, The Simpsons has been successful not in spite of being politically incorrect, but because it's politically incorrect. Look, it's true that Homer strangles his son, but it's also true Homer is a cartoon. If you're taking your parenting cues from The Simpsons, the problem is not The Simpsons, the problem is you.
Well, maybe, Evelyn, the fact is that the audience just won't buy it. That may be the simple explanation.
It very well could be, but I actually like these politically incorrect shows, and the more they stay politically incorrect and make people on the left uncomfortable, the more I'm happy with it. So I'm a little sad to see them wave in certain ways.
Well, there's a little bit of that in me too. Someone says don't, and I say I will. So I don't know. Yes, it's perhaps not actually a very good lesson. Evelyn Ray, James McPherson, thank you both so much for your time. That's it from me. Coming up next is Chris Kenny, and don't forget his special on Monday. Good night.